You're listening to the VSL Aviation Podcast. I'm your host, Seth Lake, and this is episode 16. Thanks for listening. In today's episode, we're covering part 2 of the Commercial Airman Certification Standards. Part 1, or episode 15, we covered Area of Operation 1, which covers the oral part of the check ride. So basically all the questions that I'm going to ask during the ground as an examiner, I'm getting that information from Area of Operation 1. Now, the rest of the area of operations, I'm also sampling questions, but a lot of times that happens during the pre-flight or during the flight itself. So in today's episode, we're covering area of operations 2 through 4, which is going to take us from our pre-flight to our takeoff and landing tasks. So we're going to look at all of those. We're going to save, or part 3 of the ACS for the commercial is going to be area of operation 5 through 11, which is going to take us all the way through post-flight. I've got my Airman Certification Standards pulled up for the Commercial Pilot on page 12, and we're in pre-flight pre-flight procedures. That's area of operation 2, and task A is pre-flight assessment. So page 12 of the Commercial ACS is where we're starting from. Since you might be jumping in on this episode, just a brief explanation of how the ACS works. It's broken into 3 parts: our knowledge, risk management, and skills. During the check ride, you have to demonstrate at least one knowledge topic, at least one risk management topic, and demonstrate proficiency in all of the skills. So during the podcast here, I typically focus in on the skills. If you can demonstrate proficiency in the skills listed there, you'll probably have some knowledge in risk management areas. So we'll bring those into the mix as we're talking, but we're going to focus on those 2 skill items. And there are multiple skills depending on the task. So on this one, there happens to be 2, skill S1 and S2. S1 is inspect the airplane with reference to an appropriate checklist, and S2, verify the airplane is in condition for safe flight and conforms to its type design. So those are the 2 things that you're going to be assessed on for skills. Some of the knowledge items is the pilot self-assessment. So that's the I am safe. We talked about that in previous podcasts, but kind of the I am safe checklist. ForeFlight has that on ForeFlight, kind of a self-assessment checklist. It doesn't have to be a formal checklist that you're doing, but as long as you're cognizant of what fit to flight really means for you personally on any given day. An air flight pre-flight inspection, including which items must be inspected, the reasons for checking the item, how to detect possible defects, and the associated regulations. So those are some questions that I might ask as you're going around the pre-flight. Now, it's kind of up to the DPE on how to handle this. We don't get like standardization training on this is how you inspect somebody during their pre-flight. But just me personally, as an examiner, what I do is I typically silently follow you through the walk-around. I don't ask a lot of questions during your walk-around. I'm just observing you. One of the things is I just want to observe you do the pre-flight. The other thing is I don't want to distract you, which means if I start asking questions during the pre-flight, you could miss important parts of your pre-flight. I kind of get you out of that flow, and to pick up where we left off might not be the easiest thing. So it's really easy to miss some stuff. Same reason I don't like to talk to mechanics when they're working a lot. If I go out into the shop and the mechanics are working, I like to leave them alone, because if you interrupt them, they kind of lose track where they're going, and it takes them, at the very least, time to get back into where they were at on that project. And worst case, they might forget that they have missed a step, and that's when you could have some bad things happen potentially. So I don't like to interrupt you on your pre-flight inspection. I'll watch you do the pre-flight inspection, and then I'll usually bring you back up to the front of the airplane and start asking some questions on some of the things that I have interest in. I'll make notes. If I notice that you missed something on the pre-flight, again, I won't see anything right then, but we'll come back around to it once you've completed your pre-flight. So I'll ask, hey, are you complete with your pre-flight? You'll say, yes, I'm good to go. I'm like, okay, well, walk over here with me and let me ask some questions on these. So that's just how I handle it personally as an examiner. So that's inspecting the airplane with reference to an appropriate checklist. That brings up a topic, do I expect you to walk around with the checklist in hand? It doesn't say that you have to hold the checklist as you're doing the walk around. If you want to reference the checklist once you've done the walk around in pre-flight, then that's perfectly fine. Again, I'm not here to force some of my techniques onto you as an applicant. I'm just here to watch how you do it. And if you do it safely by referencing the checklist once you're done, then that's fine. If you like to carry the checklist around with you as you do the pre-flight, then that's fine as well. Verify the airplane is in condition for safe flight and conforms to its type design. So that may be me asking questions like on the 172, which is a common plane that I use during check rides. The presence of the balance weights on the ailerons. The tips of the ailerons actually have little weights there in the leading part of the aileron. So I'll ask, hey, what are those? Are you airworthy if those are missing? Because that's something that you won't find on the type certificate data sheet or 91205 or a equipment list, right? That's just something on the airplane that's there, that's part of its type design, that if it's missing, you discover that on pre-flight, then the plane is not conforming to its type design. So that would make the plane unairworthy. That's just one example of how that could happen. But those bring up some interesting questions, asking about things missing or damaged that aren't in 91205 or the TCDS or the equipment list. How do you handle that as a pilot in command? And of course, the right answer is, hey, I'm going to seek counsel from an AMP or another experienced pilot. Or just, hey, if it doesn't look safe, then I'm just not going to fly. I'm not going to push it. So I'm going to sample your knowledge there. Then we go to flight deck management. This is task B in area of operation 2. We have 3 skills on this one. Skill 1, secure all items in the flight deck and cabin. Skill 2, conduct an appropriate pre-takeoff briefing to include identifying the PIC, use of safety belts, shoulder harnesses, doors, sterile flight deck, and emergency procedures. And skill 3, properly program and manage the airplane's automation. So those are the 3 skills that I'm going to be sampling here. Not as many knowledge or risk management items. Flying with unresolved discrepancies, that's an interesting topic to bring up risk management-wise. Something that I enjoy asking as a DPE is trying to force you into these positions that I know you're eventually going to find yourself in, and that is flying with discrepancies or flying with inoperative equipment. Most of the time, the checkride answer I get is, well, I'm just not going to fly. Well, that's kind of a checkride-y type answer, right? Because in the real world, you probably will fly an airplane at some point that has inoperative equipment. And most of the time on the checkride, I say most of the time, it's not uncommon to bring an airplane to a checkride that has inoperative equipment. So to say that, well, I'll just never fly without inoperative equipment, that's not really sustainable or, good answer. So I really want to see how you're going to do that. So if we don't have something that is a discrepancy, I may bring up, let's say, simulated. This item over here is inoperative. Can we still go fly? That'll be something I bring up, see how you handle that from a risk management standpoint. Passenger briefing requirements, almost every applicant I fly with says, hey, would you like a passenger briefing requirement? Well, now you know what my answer is going to be is yes, I would like a passenger briefing requirement because the ACS says that one of your skills is to demonstrate an appropriate pre-takeoff briefing to include, briefing on how to use the safety belt, shoulder harnesses, safety equipment, and sterile cockpit procedures. So it's not only something that you might think is a good idea normally, it's something the ACS wants you to do. So go ahead and do that with your DPE, saying, okay, here's how you use the seat belts. Here is how you use the shoulder harnesses. Here's how you use the door. Now, in real-world flying, the door is a big interest point of mine for all my passengers. So let's say I go fly in a new airplane with my family. One of the first things I do is make sure that every person in my family knows how to operate the door. Operating the door is very important, and it's something that's easy to overlook. So it's easy to help somebody get in and close the door, but then not having them operated on the ground, I think, is a mistake, because in time of emergency, when they need to get out of the plane quickly, if they've never opened that door before, that could be a serious safety hazard. So make sure your passengers know how to open the door. I don't care if they can close it, you can help them close it. And sometimes closing airplanes' doors is harder than it should be. I understand that. But they should definitely know how to open the door, just in case you're not able to help them with that task if there's an emergency. And then properly program and manage the airplane's automation. That's a big one. This needs to be done at ground speed 0, by the way. Don't try to program automation while we're taxiing. That is not a good thing to do anytime, but especially during a check ride. So make sure the plane's stopped. I don't care if we go ahead and get out of the ramp area. Let's taxi to the run-up area and get away from anybody that might be walking around a ramp. That's fine, because your airplane's kind of you've got a spinning prop hazard, you got a noise hazard, you've got maybe a prop blast hazard. So go ahead and let's get that airplane moving and away from that ramp area. Go to the run-up area. That's where we can program our automation. And of course, this is just a technique, but that's what I would recommend. And I want to see you put in a basic flight plan. It might be direct to our current airport. Like a Garmin 430, I might just say nearest to direct to Russellville, activate that. Now we have situational awareness on what our distance is to Russellville. That would be appropriate for this type of check ride. If we were doing a cross country, maybe our next airport that we're going to, our fuel stop airport, being able to show me how you understand how to program that in there. But that is a requirement in the ACS. All right, number 2, or task C, engine starting. 2 skills here. Skill 1, position the airplane properly, considering structures, other aircraft, wind, safety of nearby persons and property. And skill 2, complete the appropriate checklist. So this is a pretty straightforward one. The one risk management item is propeller safety. So, yelling clear prop, making sure you visually scan the area and everyone is clear. Those are 2 important things right there, right? Positioning the airplane properly, considering all these other effects. That's something important as well. Pilots probably don't really think about that very much, but if you shut down and you're not in a great place, you can move the airplane before you start it if you're not happy with where it's at. That might come into play if you've been, say you park at the ramp and the FBO moves you to some parking spot that's not used very often. There might be a lot of debris there on the ground. So maybe it's a good idea to have the airplane moved to a place that doesn't have as much debris before you try to start it. That's just an example scenario we might bring up. Starting under various conditions, that's a knowledge item. Starting the engine of external power. I can't say that I've ever asked that question during a check ride, but that is something that we might bring up if your plane is equipped with the means to do an external power start. And then engine limitations as they relate to starting. So that's something that I'll typically ask is, how long can we hold that starter down, or should we hold that starter down? And then what if something catches fire during a start? How are you going to handle that? So this is one of the first items that we can start bringing up emergencies during the check ride. All right, task D, taxiing. We've got 8 skills for this one. A lot of knowledge items as well, but 8 skills. So skill 1, receive and correctly read back clearances if applicable. Skill 2, use an airport diagram or taxi chart. Yes, please. Skill 3, position the flight controls for the existing wind conditions. Skill 4, complete the appropriate checklist. Skill 5, perform a brake check immediately after the airplane begins moving. Skill 6, maintain positive control of the airplane during ground operations by controlling direction and speed without excessive use of brakes. Skill 7, comply with airport taxiway markings, signals, and ATC clearances and instructions. And skill 8, position the airplane properly relative to hold lines. So 8 skills there. They're all pretty straightforward. Skill 5 is an important one. A brake check immediately after the airplane begins moving. That is a skill you're required to demonstrate on every check ride. So taxiing, release the brakes, taxi slightly forward, check the brakes every time. Practice this when you're out there flying normally. So it's not just some sort of check ride trick that you do. It's something that you should do every single time. and this is a really awkward one, because if you don't do that, is that a momentary deviation from standards? I mean, you only did it once, or you only forgot to do it once, but that's the only time you can do it. So a lot of examiners would consider this kind of a clean kill item. If you don't check the brakes immediately after the airplanes begin moving, you fail this task because you failed to demonstrate proficiency in skill 5, and you have to demonstrate proficiency in every single skill listed. So that's a quick way with a lot of examiners to fail a check ride immediately. It's hard to get it's hard to say that that's just a momentary deviation and that you could correct it. Maybe if you don't check them immediately, just slightly, because that is kind of a subjective word, I guess, immediately. After the airplane begins moving, maybe you check the brakes, is immediately 1 second, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, what's immediately? So there might be a little bit of leeway there, but please just check your brakes as soon as you start to move. And we've all done it, right? Release the brakes, plane starts to move, activate the brakes. Hey, my brakes check good. Would you like to check yours, Mr. DPE or Mrs. DPE? And sometimes we'll say, yes, I'd like to check them. Sometimes say, no, go ahead and continue your taxi. So that's how you handle that for taxiing. We're going to skip over task E because that pertains to water aircraft, and we're not doing that. Task F, before takeoff check. There are 5 skills here. Skill 1, review takeoff performance. Skill 2, complete the appropriate checklist. Skill 3, properly position the airplane considering other aircraft vessels in the wind. Skill 4, divide attention inside and outside the flight deck. Skill 5, verify the engine parameters and airplane configuration are suitable. So in the knowledge area here, we have reasons for checking each item during the run-up. There's a lot of times what we would consider the before takeoff check. This is our run-up, right? So that's one of the skills. Ensuring the airplane is in safe operating condition as recommended by the manufacturer. This is an interesting one. Again, back to the 172. This is the one place where you could check your static RPM. It's something that I really like to check in my aircraft is hold the brakes, go to full power, and I'm not necessarily doing this every flight, but hold the brakes, go to full power, and see what your static RPM is. It's interesting to point out that most of the type certificate data sheets require a static RPM number plus or minus 100 RPMs. If you're not making that static RPM, the plane is not in safe operating condition, and you need to have maintenance done. So especially in a plane I've never flown before that I might, question the validity of all of its maintenance stuff, I would ask to see a full power run up and just see if it's making the appropriate RPM for that aircraft type. So that's just one example of what you could be checking there. Other than that, I think the rest of the skills here are pretty straightforward. We're going to area of operation 3. Task A here is communication, light signals, and runway lighting systems. There are 3 skills. Select the appropriate frequencies, transmit phraseology and procedures as specified in the Aeronautical Information Manual, and acknowledge radio communications and comply with instructions. So this is that second skill. That's kind of interesting because it references directly the AIM, and I've heard this a lot from a lot of different students and other pilots that the AIM isn't regulatory in many ways. The AIM's not regulatory. It's just giving you good practices. Well, even though the phraseology isn't required per the law, it's required. It's referenced in the ACS, and the ACS is required that you meet those standards. So using non-standard phraseology that's not in the AIM, that technically violates the ACS, which could lead to a check ride failure. So look in the AIM, use that standard phraseology that the AIM tells you to use, and use that. Also, that's just good practice. Don't make up your own phraseology. Stick with what's in the AIM. All right, the rest, the other 2 things, those are pretty standard there. One of the knowledge items looking here is lost communication procedures and ATC light signal recognition. That's not something I've never done in a check ride. I've never asked for a light show while doing a check ride. That is something that you can ask for, though, in regular training is CFIs, or if you're a student getting ready for your check ride, this would be a great time to fly to another airport with a tower. And when you land, try to pick a time where it's not going to be super busy. But when you land, ask ATC for a light show, and they will give you a light gun demonstration while you're holding short of the runway. And that's a good time for you to review not only what those lights look like, but what the light gun signals mean. So I think that's an excellent way that you can practice this prior to your check ride. I don't typically do that on a check ride, but it would be great training to get prior to your check ride. Task B, traffic patterns. There's 6 skills here. Skill 1, properly identify and interpret airport, seaplane, base runways, taxiways, markings, signs, and lighting. Comply with recommended traffic pattern procedures. Correct for wind drift to maintain the proper ground track. Maintain orientation with the runway landing area in use. Maintain traffic pattern altitude plus or minus 100 feet and the appropriate airspeed plus or minus 10 knots. Maintain situation awareness and proper spacing from other aircraft in the traffic pattern. I forgot to list each of those out as a skill, but those are the 6 skills there. So this is the first one in the commercial where we see an objective flight standard, and that's the plus or minus 100 feet, plus or minus 10 knots. So that is those are the ACS limits to your altitude and airspeed while you're flying a pattern. So you need to be able to make sure you can fly a pattern consistently, plus or minus 100 feet, plus or minus 10 knots. What I would highly recommend is learning the power setting that equals the airspeed at a given configuration. So what I mean by that is in like a Cessna, for instance, you're probably looking around 2,000 RPMs, no flaps, and trimmed and level flight for the downwind. That should equal an airspeed that's pretty reasonable for a downwind. You're going to have different power settings like 1,500 RPMs and 1 notch of flaps and a little bit of nose-up trim. That would equal a stable base to final kind of airspeed with the descent in there. Those are the types of, when I say fly the numbers, you need to be able to fly the numbers so it'll equal that airspeed, and you don't have to chase the airspeed constantly in the downwind because there's a lot of other things happening, and you need to be looking outside because that's the most likely place you'll find close contact with other airplanes. On to skill or area of operation 4. So this is a long one. This is our takeoffs, landings, and go-arounds. So this is kind of a big portion of the check ride. And immediately you can see here for our first one, our normal takeoff and climb. This is task A. We have 14 skills. I'm not actually going to read off all 14 of these because I think if I read all of the skills for all of this, it would make the podcast or video a little too long. So you need to reference these, and I'm just going to talk highlights out of all of these that I think are important to cover. But read through these 14 skills for just a normal takeoff and climb. So this isn't short field or soft field. This is just normal. We have the 14 skills. Of those, we have rotate and lift off the recommended airspeed and accelerate to VY. Okay, that's normal. Establish a pitch attitude, maintain manufacturer's recommended airspeed or VY plus or minus 5 knots. So plus or minus 5 knots, that is the objective standard we're looking for VY plus or minus 5 knots. Maintain plus or minus 5 knots to a safe maneuvering altitude. So there we have an objective plus or minus 5 knots combined with a subjective safe maneuvering altitude. So what does that mean to you? Most numbers that I hear are either 400, 500, or 1,000 feet. Whatever you use, just be prepared to defend it. I'm not saying that there's a right or wrong answer. There probably is a wrong answer. A safe maneuvering altitude, calling that 20 feet, I don't buy it. That's not really a safe maneuvering altitude. 50 feet, okay, but I would like to hear that argument. 400 feet. I like that number because that's the altitude that we can begin a diverse departure in instrument conditions. So diverse departure starts at 400 feet. So I'll buy that. 500 feet is a nice round number, so if you wanted to use that as safe maneuvering altitude, I get it. 1,000 feet, I understand this one as well, because if you wanted to say 1,000 feet is my safe maneuvering, that is a safe maneuvering altitude for sure. Now, depending on your airplane, it may take you a significant amount of time to get to 1,000 feet. So if you're going to try to get to 1,000 feet before you turn crosswind, for instance, in some airplanes, that could delay your crosswind turn significantly, where you're kind of in a place people don't expect to look for people that are in the pattern, because you would be, a couple miles upwind, and kind of in my mind, that's outside of the normal pattern range. So just figure out what the safe maneuvering altitude is for your aircraft type. And be prepared to defend that, saying, yep, this is the altitude I'm going to define as my safe maneuvering altitude. And that's when you can start maybe going above that VY speed to a normal cruise climb speed. A normal approach and landing. We have 12 skills here. So some of these skills that are the objective ones. We have skill 7, and that's maintain manufacturer's published approach speed, or in its absence, not more than 1.3 VSO plus or minus 5 knots with a wind gust factor applied. So that's important. Touchdown point, skill 10, touchdown at a proper pitch attitude within 200 feet beyond or on the specified point with no side drift and with the airplane's longitudinal axis aligned and over the runway center line / landing path. That's an important one. So it's on or 200 feet beyond your aim point. Do not land short. Just don't land short. Any of these tasks, don't land short. If you learn one thing from listening to this, what I'm telling you is on your check ride, don't land short. In real life, don't land short, right? The way I explain it is, imagine you're landing on a runway that's an island in a lake of lava. Of course, that wouldn't be a really good idea, but if you landed short, you would land in the lava, and that's not good. You don't want to land in lava. So now, landing long, not big deal, because you're still on the runway, right? So if you land long, you're on the runway, you can recognize, hey, I landed long, and I need to go around because I'm not going to be able to stop in time. So you can make the decision to go around after you touch down, as long as you touch down long. If you touch down short, you land in the proverbial lava, and it's game over. Now, in the real world, we're not landing in lava, but if you touch down short, you might be touching down on something that's not a runway, and that could damage the aircraft. That could cause an accident. That is definitely a safety concern. So do not land short. And this skill here says on or 200 feet beyond your aim point with the longitudinal axis aligned. So make sure we're not landing in a crab. That's what that means, is don't land in a crab. I don't need to feel this left-right side load when we land. It needs to be a nice smooth touchdown with the longitudinal axis aligned with the runway. Skill 11, execute a timely go-around if the approach cannot be made within tolerance specified above or any other condition that may result in an unsafe approach or landing. So right there, I love this, because one of the skills is telling you to go around if you need to go around. So don't be afraid to go around on your check ride. I've seen way too many times a pilot try to force a bad landing because they're on a check ride and they think that they're going to fail if they have to go around on their check ride. That is absolutely not the case. In fact, I'm more likely to issue a disapproval for someone who should have gone around and didn't than someone who could have definitely made a landing but decided to go around instead. In fact, I don't think I would ever issue a disapproval for somebody that, the landing looked great, it's all stable, and just for some reason they go around. I might scratch my head a little bit thinking that, well, that was a perfectly fine landing. I'm not sure why you decided to go around, but I'm not going to issue a disapproval because of that decision. You can always go around. That's your decision. So I won't give you a disapproval for going around. I might give you a disapproval for not going around, especially when you need to go around. Soft field landing. This is task C. or sorry, soft field takeoff, task C, we have 14, I believe it's just 14 skills. Again, not going to read them all off. Skill 9, that's interesting. Lift off the lowest possible airspeed and remain in ground effect while accelerating to VX or VY as appropriate. Establish pitch attitude for VX or VY as appropriate, and begin your climb. And let's see, maintain VX, VY as appropriate plus or minus 5 knots to a safe maneuvering altitude. There's that safe maneuvering altitude phrase again. And maintain directional control, proper wind drift correction throughout the takeoff and climb. Skill 13, that one that I just read, that's probably one that I see people struggle with the most, is they don't release those crosswind controls in time, and so as soon as we take off, we start drifting. You really want to let the plane crab at that point. So let the plane crab at that point, and now you're trying to maintain runway heading as you climb out, or runway track as you climb out. So you're following that correct path. So on a non-towered field, I'm going to do my best to maintain runway track on my upwind. On a towered field, if they give me maintain runway heading, I'm going to maintain runway heading, which means I'll maintain a heading and I'll wind up getting blown off of runway centerline. But those are two different environments, right? So for the most part, I'm going to release those crosswind controls and try to crab to maintain that alignment with the runway on the upwind path that I take. We've got a lot of knowledge and risk management items here. Rejected takeoff, engine failure during takeoff, collision hazards, low altitude maneuvering, and distractions. Those are all some risk management items we could talk about. Knowledge items includes VX, VY, appropriate configuration, ground effect, and importance of weight transfer from wheels to wings, and then left turning tendencies. Some of those knowledge items, I don't have to ask a question on it. I can see how you handle that on how you manage the airplane. So if I see you mishandling the airplane, then I know there might be a knowledge item lacking there, and that may lead me to ask questions that are drawn from this knowledge area. So that's task C. Task D, soft field approach and landing. There are 13 skills here. Maintain manufacturer's published airspeed 1.3 VSO plus or minus 5 knots with a gust factor applied. Skill 9, make a smooth, timely, and correct control inputs during the round out and touchdown. And for tricycle gear airplanes, keep the nose wheel off the surface until loss of elevator effectiveness. Man, this one gets messed up a lot. This is telling you to hold the elevator all the way back, and the nose will not touch until that elevator has lost effectiveness and the nose settles down on its own, while you have that elevator yoke or the stick all the way back in a tricycle gear aircraft, right? We're handling this different in a tailwheel configuration, but most of the check rides they give are in tricycle gears, especially now. So all the way back until the elevator loses authority. That's when the elevator comes down. Touchdown at a proper pitch attitude with minimal sink rate. And we also have execute a timely go-around is in there, right? So again, go-arounds are free. It's even listed in one of the skills. So it's interesting that the soft field approach doesn't list, it's not our minus 0 plus 200. It doesn't list those numbers. So really we're looking at kind of the first third of the runway for when you touch down, but realize this isn't an accuracy touchdown. So if you're aiming for the 1,000-foot markers and you try to force it down on the 1,000-foot markers or any other aim point for that matter, it's going to be impossible for you to meet the other requirements of the soft field, because the point of the soft field is to hold the plane off until it's done flying, or hold the nose off until it's done flying, which means you're probably going to float a little bit. In a normal soft field landing, you'll typically float a little bit more because a good technique is to add a little bit of engine power during the flare or just after the flare to help keep as much lift into the wings as possible and as little weight on the wheels as possible, and make that gradual adjustment. Imagining that you're in that soft, muddy, or grassy field, keeping that nose protected. The nose protected is the most important thing for the soft field landing. That's why that task is in there of holding the nose up until the elevator loses authority. All right, short field takeoff and maximum performance climb. This is task E. We have 15 skills here. We've got rotate liftoff at recommended speed, plus or minus 5 knots, establish pitch attitude, plus or minus 5 knots until the obstacle is cleared or until the airplane is 50 feet above the surface. And then after clearing the obstacle, establish pitch for VY and accelerate and maintain VY plus or minus 5 knots. And then maintain VY plus or minus 5 knots until a safe maneuvering altitude. So here we're clearing a simulated 50-foot obstacle. At VX, we're transitioning into VY, and we're holding VY until we're at that magical safe maneuvering altitude, whatever you've determined that to be. Then from that safe maneuvering altitude, we can transition to a yet faster speed, like an en route cruise, up to our pattern altitude, or we might be departing the area and up to a different altitude, but whatever, we're going to get away from VY. I guess this is a good point. One of the things that I see a lot of single engine pilots doing is flying at a VX or VY all the way up to their pattern or cruise altitude. Just know that in a piston aircraft, that can lead to a lot of kind of unnecessary wear on the engine, mainly because VX and VY are really relatively slow airspeeds, and slow airspeeds means less airflow going in to cool your engine, which could mean higher operating temperatures. So I prefer, once we're at a safe maneuvering altitude, to pitch over maybe another 10 or 15 knots above VY and climb out at a faster airspeed. It gives my engine more airflow and is just generally a little bit better on my engine health. You'll notice that that's trained in higher performance pistons, and it might change yet again when you go fly turbine aircraft, but at least for most pistons, I think the best path is to go VX, VY for as little time as possible, and basically to clear an obstacle and get to a safe maneuvering altitude. And then you want to accelerate to an en route cruise speed that's going to be the best for your engine here. So let's talk about a couple of the risk management items. Engine failure during takeoff phase of flight, rejected takeoff, low altitude maneuvering, including stall spin or CFIT, and then distractions. Those are all some of those. The knowledge items, there's just 3 knowledge items here. So effects of atmospheric conditions, including wind on takeoff and climb performance, VX and VY, I guess their definitions, and then appropriate airplane configuration. So not so many skills, or knowledge items, but a lot of skills. All right, task F, short field approach and landing. And this has 13 skills. So skill 10, I'm going to go straight to that one. Touchdown at the proper pitch attitude within 100 feet beyond or on the specified point, threshold markings or runway numbers with no side drift, minimum float, and with the airplane's longitudinal axis aligned with and over the runway center line. So, the specified point, threshold markings, or runway numbers. As an examiner, most of the time, I'm going to tell you to aim for the 1,000-foot markers. The reason is, if I tell you to aim at the numbers and there's any obstacles or terrain prior to the runway surface itself, and a lot of times there might be fences or power lines or roads where we could have vehicles on it, I really don't want you to try to get in ground effect and float into your aim point, which means we would be getting into ground effect prior to the actual runway surface, which is going to put us really close to obstacles. So I don't even want to put you in that position. So that's the reason that I'm having you aim at the 1,000-foot markers. The other reason is, and I've gone over this in other podcasts and in videos, is that a lot of airports have a visual glide slope, and that visual glide slope is typically around 3 degrees. And if you do the math on that, the visual glide slope indicators themselves sit about 1,000 feet down the runway. They bring you in at a 3-degree glide slope, which means they're going to help you clear the runway threshold at about 50 feet. So we're we're checking the boxes as far as clearing a simulated 50-foot obstacle on a 3-degree glide slope and touching down at that point. So that's something that I just do as a rule, is I have you aim at the 1,000-foot markers, and if the PAPIs are there, feel free to use the PAPIs or VASIs or the visual glide slope indicator to help you clear the 50-foot obstacle and touch down on your point of the 1,000-foot markers. So that is the short field landing. Again, you don't want to land short here. It's okay to land a little long with because it says there in skill 10, minimal float. So land on that point with minimal float and within the airplane's longitudinal axis over the runway center line. So land on center line, land on your point. Don't land short. If you do land long, so if you go past that minimal float, go around. Make the decision. If you do land long, go around. Make that decision early. Add power and go around. Even if we touch down and we've touched down after you've already decided to go around, that's still perfectly fine with me. I'm not going to issue a disapproval for that, because in the real world, if you're on a short field and you float past your aim point, you're at a flying airspeed, you can successfully go around. What you can't do is decide to commit to the landing and then you don't have enough runway in front of you to stop. That's the most dangerous thing to do. So just go ahead and go around, and that's fine. That's in here as a skill 12. Execute a timely go around if approach cannot be made. So go arounds are free again. Task G is for seaplanes only, as is Task H and I and J and K and L. So now here we are at M. This is the dreaded power off, 180 degree accuracy approach and landing. So the power off 180, usually I quote that as being maybe the crux of the commercial checkride, either this or 8s on pylons. I think this is a little more challenging because winds have a big effect on this. If you have practiced this in calm wind conditions and you take your checkride and you've got a gusty headwind or crosswind, it's a challenge. So go out and practice these in different wind conditions so you're as prepared as possible when it comes time for your checkride. Don't just practice these in calm wind conditions. There are 8 skills you have to demonstrate here. The key one, I think, is skill 8, and that's touchdown on the appropriate pitch attitude within 200 feet beyond or on the specified point with no side drift. The airplane's longitudinal axis aligned with the runway, center line, or path as applicable. So you're selecting a point. Again, this is typically going to be the 1,000-foot markers. You're pulling the power when you're 180 degrees out from that, or when you're abeam that point and you're making a 180-degree turn with no power and you're landing on that point. I think one of the confusing items on this is a lot of people think that this is an emergency maneuver. This isn't simulating an engine failure, at least I don't think. There's nothing in the ACS that says that this is an emergency maneuver. It just says that it's an accuracy maneuver. So it's an aircraft mastery maneuver. So because it's not an emergency maneuver, I don't expect you to maneuver the airplane as if you were in an emergency, which happens a lot, right? We wind up doing this kind of big high-ACA turn and really just doing an unstable approach. And the defense that I get from pilots who do this is that, oh, it's an emergency maneuver, I'm going to do whatever it takes to get on the runway. My answer is no. The power off 180 is not an emergency maneuver. It's an accuracy maneuver. So you need to position the airplane, and you need to practice this while you're practicing this maneuver. You need to position the airplane so that you can, with power off, make a normal-ish stabilized approach to the runway. Now, that might mean flying the downwind closer, right? It might mean turning base earlier. So don't try to fly a normal pattern, because a lot of times you're going to end up short if you do that. But don't fly such a tight pattern that we're having to do these big high-ACA maneuvers to get on the ground, because remember, this is not an emergency maneuver. This is an accuracy maneuver. You're demonstrating accuracy with the airplane, which demonstrates your mastery of the plane, which all in all, that's what this check ride's all about, is showing mastery of the airplane. All right, task N, go around rejected landing. There are 8 skills here. I think all of our landing skills included the go around or rejected landing in either the risk management or the skill items themselves. So it's a little redundant that it has a task of its own, but this just shows that it is required that we do a go around. So it is required that we make a timely decision to discontinue approach to landing, apply takeoff power, configure the airplane, maneuver to the side of the runway landing area when necessary to clear conflicting traffic, and then plus or minus 5 knots until a safe maneuvering altitude. So a go-around is required on your check ride. We will do one, and we'll do one because task N requires a go-around. So that takes us to Area of Operation 5, and we're going to stop the show right there. What we've done is we've covered Area of Operations 1 through 4 now. So on 5, the next episode, we're going to go, let me go back to the table of contents here and just show you where we're at. So we did 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then Area of Operation 5 is our performance. We have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and we'll probably skip over Area of Operation 10 because that's just multi-engine. So on the next episode, we'll finish up the ACS, including the appendix section. It'll probably be a little bit longer show. Then the next series is going to be about the multi-engine commercial, which I'm really excited about because that's what I specialize in, is teaching the multi-engine commercial. Anyway, I'll wrap this show up. I'm hoping you're finding this helpful. I am getting a little bit of feedback from different listeners, and I really appreciate it. If you want to send feedback to sethlake@bsl.aero, also info@bsl.aero, you can leave a review on Apple Podcast. I'd really appreciate that. Subscribe to the podcast. You can leave a comment on the YouTube show. I try to respond to the comments. It kind of comes in waves. I'll let a few build up and then I'll respond to them. But I'll get you if you leave a review there. And anyway, I'll